Hello, welcome everyone to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series. If you're new to New Hampshire Peace Action, we educate, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this bi-weekly conversation series as a way to continue our public education work. We found it so effective that we've decided to continue it on indefinitely. This bi-weekly online series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for. In the spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to acknowledge that we are doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. And we honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding through the generations. Tonight, we have Diane Stradling. She's going to be talking to us about the U.S. Blockade and conflict with Cuba. A bit on Zoom etiquette. If you are happy to have your video, we're happy that if you keep your video on, but you're welcome to turn it off if you are nervous about being live streamed. We are live streamed tonight. As we get to the Q&A section, I'll be moderating that. If you'd like to ask your questions yourself, you can use the hand raise feature or put an asterisk in the chat and I'll call on you. And if you would like me to ask your question, you can just type that question into the chat at any time. So as we know, not every war is fought with guns and bullets. The US has been attempting to gain control over Cuba for more than a century. But since the last Cuban Revolution over 60 years ago, this embargo war has escalated, causing the Cuban people to suffer. Diane Stradling, a longtime Cuba activist, will describe the impact of the blockade, how it differs from an embargo, and how it affects the lives of Cubans on a daily basis. She's going to update us on the current administration's actions towards Cuba, as well as discuss the limited viewpoint that we see in our mainstream press. Diane is a progressive activist involved with issues of peace and racial justice and reproductive rights, immigration, and the environment. During her undergraduate studies in sociology at City College in New York, she says she spent as much time going to demonstrations in DC as attending classes. She hoped to join the Venceramos Brigade in 1969, but didn't actually reach Cuba until 2003. Since then, she's been there 10 times, bringing humanitarian aid, helping build houses, and leading delegations through Witness for Peace. These delegations help participants learn about life on a small island nation under siege. Diane will share her experiences during these visits, as well as describe her current involvement with the National Network on Cuba's Saving Lives campaign. Diane has an MED in Organization and Management from Antioch and was the director of several nonprofit social service organizations in Keene and Portsmouth. Diane, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Take it away.
Oh, and thank you, Will, and thank you, Amy, so much for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm absolutely delighted. And Doreen, who isn't with us, but she was very, very helpful. I want to start out by saying I'm not an expert on Cuba or US-Cuba relations, and any mistakes or errors I make are entirely mine. I'm first and foremost a student on this subject, and I am a longtime activist who is anxious to dialogue around issues related to Cuba. Part of my intention this evening to spark this dialogue, particularly in New Hampshire, but I know there are people from all over the country online right now, but to connect with others and to create an ongoing opportunity to learn together. To that end, I will put my email in the chat, and I hope to hear from those of you who are interested in exploring Cuba together, both virtually and eventually in person, both here and in Cuba. There were also resources which I need to check with Will. I think they were sent out this morning, books and information about websites that Doreen said she was going to be sending out. And if they're not, we will send them to you afterwards. Because they're very important. So, as Will has already said, this war against Cuba is not at this time being fought with guns or bullets, but there are weapons, and these weapons are used intentionally to disrupt the lives of the people of Cuba, especially women and children, and also they attempt to drive a wedge between the people of Cuba and the Cuban government. In Cuba, these disruptions, not yet, Will. In Cuba, can you focus back on me for a second? And then we'll go there. Thank you. In Cuba, these disruptions produce severe economic hardship, lack of food, medicine, personal care products, and women, we all know what that means, medical equipment, lack of remittances from family members who normally would be able to help their families out in Cuba. They're not able to do that right now. A lack of fuel for cooking, for running generators, lights, tractors. They're farming with oxen instead of being able to use tractors, buses, and cars. So the ability to travel is very much reduced. Ability to earn a living, interruptions to tourism way before COVID, a lack of remittances, as I said. There are social and psychological implications, and these disruptions, including family separation. Families aren't able, even on the island, to visit each other because they can't get around, earn a living, interruption. Sense of safety and security when you're living under siege. So this is having a huge impact on the people in Cuba. Will, can you come back to me, just to me for a minute? So thank you. I want to be able to see everybody. And Cubans use the verb resolver to describe what they do on a daily basis to cope with these challenges. Cubans are very resourceful and very resilient, but there is a limit for everyone. The war against Cuba is primarily fought by three intersecting and overlapping forces. And because I'm a visual person, I tend to think about the picture of this visually, and Will, you can put up my three-legged stool now. These are the intersecting and overlapping forces that impact Cuba. Do we have that picture?
Sorry, I'm on my way. I was working on changing the title on our Facebook stream.
So I need the three-legged stool picture now.
All right. How's that?
No, that's the next one down. Will is helping me out with these pictures because I'm on an iPad, not on a computer. Okay, so here's my three-legged stool. The first leg of the stool, and the longest that I will talk about, this is the US standing on a stool. The legs of the stool are pressing right down on Cuba. The first leg of the stool, US policies, acts, and regulations that impact Cuba. The second one says contractors, and these are activities of US-sponsored contractors. These are the people who do our dirty work. And the third, US press, the media, news, how we get our news and how that news impacts on Cuba. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first, which is US policies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those policies. I'm going to run through them quickly. There are so many. There are many more than I have been able to describe to you. Okay. The first policy that I wanted to discuss with you is the 1823 Monroe Doctrine. I just want to mention that is the cornerstone of future US policy in the hemisphere. And this is very early on, way before much of anything else is happening. In 1902, this is important. Cuba has been fighting a war of independence against Spain for literally hundreds of years. It has been under Spanish control, and it's ready. Cuba is ready for to be out of under the thumb of Spain. And it fought two wars that were not successful. In 1895, it started the Third War of Independence, and it was almost on the verge of winning that war when the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, it had just arrived there, was blown up, giving the United States an excuse to intervene in the war, which the Cubans had just about won, but the US came in a few months, that war was over. And as part of the settlement of that war, there was a peace treaty, I believe it was signed in Paris. The Cubans called the War of Independence. We called it the Spanish-American War. And as part of the, as part of the agreement at the end of that war, when the peace treaty was signed, Cuba was completely left out of it. The treaty was signed between US and Spain. Excuse me. So now Cuba has come out from under the thumb of Spain, but has the US sitting on its shoulders. The US military is in Cuba, and the Cubans are ready to be on their own. The Cuban Constitution, written in 1902, written primarily, by the way, probably by the United States, has in it the Platt Amendment. And I'm just going to quickly tell you what the Platt Amendment says, because it's a critically important policy. So US will withdraw from Cuba under the condition that the new Cuban Constitution includes the Platt Amendment, giving the US the right to intervene militarily in the island, in island affairs, and requires the leasing of land for military bases. Cubans are not happy about this, but they agree because it's the only way, that they can get the US military out of the island. And they sign the Platt Agreement. In 1934, and the US did intervene militarily in 1906 and 1912, twice it came into the island and intervened. It was in 1934 that the Platt Amendment was finally abrogated. It was no longer could the US intervene militarily, but the other part of the Platt Agreement about leasing land for military bases is still in effect. And we know that because we have Guantanamo sitting there. It was all part of this agreement from 1902. In 1917, the Trading with the Enemy Act, an act that would later allow US presidents to apply sanctions to Cuba, is passed in 1917. And executive action has been taken to renew sanctions every year since 1961. So we are still dealing with the Trading with the Enemy Act. Will, you can bring us back to people now if you want. We don't need to keep this picture up. During the time after the Spanish-American War and after the Constitution is written, the world is dealing with two world wars, with the economic collapse, and with prohibition in the United States. But there's no prohibition in Cuba. And this is when Cuba gets a little bit wild. There are, there's mafia, there are all kinds of activities going on, prostitution, drugs dealing, and it's not an easy place for the Cubans to be living because they're not getting any benefit out of it. U.S. military is not there, but U.S. Businesses have taken over much of Cuba, and they are bringing in people from the United States, and it's not benefiting the Cuban people at all. Batista is elected in 1940, and it seems at first that he's going to do some good things for Cuba, but that doesn't last very long. And he leaves the country for a while. He comes back, and he is running for president again. It looks like he's not going to win, so he declares himself president of Cuba. Meanwhile, Fidel and the revolutionaries are in the mountains, and the Cuban Revolution is starting. Batista leaves Cuba, I think it's New Year's Eve of right before the revolution, so it's 1958. And he leaves with the entire Cuban treasury. So there's no money left in Cuba. The revolution happens. And at the beginning, Fidel did approach the United States, and he said that he would like to establish some kind of relationship with the United States. He needed money, basically. And the United States said, no way. And that opened the door for the Soviet Union to come into Cuba. And that relationship went on until for quite a while. But right at the very beginning, in 1961, the Foreign Assistance Act established a total trade embargo on Cuba. So this is where the trade embargo started in Cuba in 1961, prohibiting US funds for any program benefiting Cuba. So while the US had been supporting Cuba, had been giving Cuba money all these years and helping US corporations, United Fruit Company, Exxon, all of these big companies are in Cuba. They've taken over the country. Now with the revolution, Fidel is not obviously continuing, and he is going to get rid of all the US corporations. The Foreign Assistance Act, establishing a total embargo on Cuba and prohibits US funds for any program. This is when the Bay of Pigs happens. This is when the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and we are close to war at that point. In the Soviet Union collapses. In 1992, the US passes the Torricelli Act. This is a special period in Cuba after Cuba was very dependent on the Soviet Union for trade, for support. And Cuba, when the Soviet Union collapsed, entered into a special period, very, very, very difficult time for Cuba. And what does the US do? It passes the Torricelli Act, which it doesn't say Cuba is a sovereign nation and we should help our neighbors. It tightens the sanctions against Cuba. It prohibits the shipment of food and medicine, which is against international law completely. It bans subsidiary US firms. We already have an embargo in place between the US and Cuba. Now in 1992, the US says no subsidiary of a US firm in a third country can trade with Cuba. Any ships arriving in Cuba cannot enter US ports for 180 days. So more of the way to make things very difficult for Cuba. Okay, we're almost at the end. In 1996, the Helms-Burton Act, this is under President Clinton, codifies the embargo. What that means is the embargo is now under US Congress. It is the we all know about executive orders. We've heard a lot about executive orders over the last few years. And up until now, the embargo could have ended via an executive order by one of the presidents. But once the embargo is codified, which happens in 1996, it will take an act of Congress to end the embargo. The president cannot end the embargo. And the embargo, of course, is in place to this day. In 1996, the Helms-Burton Act also establishes sanctions for non-US companies trading with Cuba. So first we have no trade between the US and Cuba. Then we have no subsidiaries in third countries trading with Cuba. Now we have the US saying, even if you're not a US company, we don't want you trading with Cuba. It also, and here's an important part that's going to get us to our second part of our stool, the stool that the US is standing on. The Helms-Burton Act allocates funding for subversive pro-democracy programs through contractors. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. That's the second leg of our stool. What also happens during this time is Brothers to the Rescue, and I'll talk about that if anybody wants to hear about it. I don't want to go into too much detail right now. Brothers to the Rescue, 98, the Cuban Five, 2000, Elian Gonzalez. So there's a lot of activity happening in the 1990s. Under Obama, there's some easement. He's the first sitting president since 1923, I believe, who actually travels to Cuba. Barack and Michelle and the kids are walking around Havana, and they go to a baseball game, and there's all this friendly activity. And in fact, Americans are traveling to Cuba. This is a time when I took, in 4 years in a row, took groups to Cuba. And the thing to understand about this was a time when people were saying to me, oh, Obama ended the embargo. And again, Obama cannot end the embargo. No president could end the embargo. So I kept explaining to people, no, that wasn't the case. But he did do some things to ease the tension between the countries. However, Obama's intention never changed. The intention that it's again, not Cuba is our neighbor, it's a sovereign country, we're going to let live and let live. No, Obama said, the embargo isn't working. We're going to change tactics here, not intentions, just tactics, so that we are still going to ultimately want to see this Cuban experiment end. Trump comes into, can hardly talk about him, but 234 new sanctions on Cuba came under Trump. Biden is running for president. He says, I am going to restore Cuban relations back to the Obama era. Sounds good. It's still not ending the embargo, but it's certainly better than what was happening under Trump. Biden gets elected. Not only does he not undo what Trump did, which he could easily have done, which he still can easily do, he added more sanctions. And the only thing that has happened in the last maybe week or week and a half is that he said, we're going to make an effort to open the embassy again, which needs to happen. So that's the only positive thing that has come out of Biden since he became president. Okay, thank you for your patience. That was a lot of talking about policies. The second leg of the stool, contractors. This is really interesting and something that most people don't know much about. The Department of State, USAID money, Agency for International Development money, has been around for years to promote democracy projects in Cuba. This has been going on for a long, long time. I'm going to tell you about what just happened this year. July 2021, the State Department is authorized to spend $20 million on democracy promotion projects in Cuba. And that's starting this October 1st. The federal fiscal year starts October 21st. And what happens is that they put out RFPs for grants, and people can write a grant. If you are an international development firm or a nonprofit, you can write a grant to USAID and get money to promote democracy in Cuba. And there's millions and millions of dollars that get spent and wasted every year because they spend money on things like radio programs to Cuba that Cuba blocks, that they can't, that goes nowhere, but millions of dollars get spent on programs like that. Civil society, independent media, free flow of information. These are all the keywords that they use. Promoting human rights, you'll hear that over and over again. There's one company called CAI, if anybody knows about it, I don't. They have received from USAID $1.8 billion to date. So the underlying goals of all of these projects is to try, again, to foment unrest and break the tie between the people of Cuba and the Cuban government. This is the way to go. The US cannot invade Cuba. As much as the mayor of Miami has been advocating that for a couple of months now. Why don't we just go in and take over? The US basically can't do that. But it is doing it through all of these projects that it funds. To look up, I'm going to tell you about something to Google: Cuba Money Project. Not right now, but when we're done, you'll find out all about it. However, when these organizations get money, they get a grant, they often then contract with other companies, with other development or nonprofit organizations, and they subcontract, and it's very, very hard to follow the money, but a lot of money is spent. And the US government every to achieve, rather than providing humanitarian aid, development assistance would be so useful, although I don't know that Cuba would even accept it. The third leg of our stool, US media, mainstream media, is extremely one-sided when it comes to Cuba. There's an incredible amount of misinformation there. They represent, more so than in other ways, the government side to dealing with Cuba and the Cuban American side of the story. I'm not talking about Fox News. I'm not talking about the Miami Herald. We know about them. I'm talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN, and unfortunately, NPR. They interview, when something happens in Cuba, they immediately go to interview people like Marco Rubio, Bob Menendez, Mario Diaz-Balart. They don't ask the opinion of Patrick Leahy, Jim McGovern, Barbara Lee, people who have a different take on Cuba, who support Cuba, and who can explain what's going on in a very different way than the other people who are usually interviewed. Beware when you read something or hear something from the press, if they introduce Cuba as the dictatorship, the communist regime, the human rights violators, you know what point of view you're going to get, and it's only that point of view. So it's really, really important that you read everything with a grain of salt. There are in the information that I hope went out this morning. I don't know if it did. Did it go out this morning, Will? And Doreen said she sent it out. Anyway, there are there's information about like Cuba news, where to get good information about Cuba. And if you didn't get it, I will get it to you. And I also want to tell you about some of the things that are never reported in the press. Some of Cuba's incredible achievements that are never, ever talked about. Free universal education at all levels. I think we have a picture somewhere about kids in school. Illiteracy is wiped out. The Cuban literacy campaign, which happened right after the election, where high school students volunteer to go out into the countryside to teach the campesinos how to read and write, was an incredible achievement. Cuba has a very, very high literacy rate. Do we have that picture, Will? I have a picture of
That's the one you're looking for?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a Cuban classroom. I had the opportunity, if you go to visit Cuba with an international organization like Pastors for Peace or Witness for Peace Solidarity, you can have the opportunity to visit schools, to see classrooms, to see students in school. So the literacy campaign and free education all the way through, as high as you want to go in school. The next one is the Henry Reeve International Medical Brigade. Here's a picture of them arriving in, I think this is Peru. The brigade brings health care to serve countries facing crisis. They will do West Africa to people who are suffering from the Ebola epidemic. At the beginning of COVID, they went to Italy to help Italy out. It's not a third world country, but they are having a very hard time medically, and they help them out. If you hear, and they have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and we're hoping that they will get it, the Henry Reeve International Medical Brigade. If you hear anything about them, you're going to hear about coercive labor practices, claiming that these doctors are forced to go. And it's absolutely not true. Absolutely not. They do get paid a little extra, but they do go. The Latin American Medical School. We never hear anything about the Latin American Medical School. This is one of the crowning achievements in my way of thinking. In 1999, Fidel started the Latin American Medical School. Here's a picture of it. It's a wonderful place to visit. Over 124 countries in Latin America, Africa, around the world have sent students to this school to become doctors so they can go back to their home countries and serve their underserved people in their countries. To date, from 1999, they have graduated 30,000 doctors and sent them around the world. In 2001, the US was invited, and through IFCO Pastors for Peace, who takes the initial applications, the US started sending students, and 208 students have graduated from the Latin American Medical School. They're serving all over the United States, in Harlem, in South Chicago, in Oakland, in any community that needs doctors that are underserved. These graduates of the Latin American Medical School. It's an incredible place to visit. And the last thing I want to mention is the biotechnical pharmaceutical achievements. There are 5 COVID vaccines that were created in Cuba. They had difficulty at first, not with the vaccines, but with syringes. But the Saving Lives campaign of the National Network on Cuba and Bob Schwartz have enabled the shipment of syringes to Cuba. And now the Cuban Ministry of Health says that 90% of the population of Cuba will be vaccinated by the end of November. There are still great needs there, needs for food, needs for other medicines, but these are some of the achievements. And I want to mention one more important aspect of this, and this biomedical field in Cuba, is that they have treatments for problems that we have in the United States that we do not have access for, including a treatment for diabetic foot ulcers. Diabetes is a huge problem in the United States. People are losing their legs because of these foot ulcers. Cuba has a treatment for them. Because of the embargo, that treatment cannot get here. Cuba has a vaccine for lung cancer, cannot be here because of the US embargo. So not only is Cuba hurting, but we're hurting because of this strain. I want to stop now, and I want to give you a chance to hear from Cubans themselves. We have a short, wonderful video that we're going to show. I hope you can all hear it. We probably have to turn the volume up really loud on it. But I'd like to start because it's an opportunity to hear, not from me, but from Cubans about the war on Cuba. So we're going to start watching that now.
Hi, I'm Liz. People come to Havana looking for the real Cuba, and this is what they do. But this is not my Cuba. My Cuba isn't so romantic, but I'm happy here. I love my country. Cuba is safe. We've got free healthcare and education. I graduated from university without paying a penny, and I became a journalist.
Pero lo mejor que tiene Cuba es su gente.
But we've got one huge problem, the economy.
La situación está mala.
Malísima.
Fea. Pésimamente mal.
Está difícil.
Estresante.
Caótica.
En Pambela.
Ahora mismo está fatal.
A mí ni me pregunto.
During the pandemic, people have to wait in line for hours just to buy food.
Aquí la cosa está dura. COVID. I'm used to this. I grew up in crisis.
Y no es embargo ni bloqueo. Es guerra.
The legislation I signed today further tightens that embargo. By maintaining our embargo,
El bloqueo económico persiste.
Cruel e insensato bloqueo que haya existido contra nación.
Our government blames pretty much everything on the US embargo. They call it the blockade.
Es que lo queman mucho.
We get bored of hearing about the blockade all the time. But it's real. The United States has been waging war against Cuba for 60 years. It's not a war with bullets or bombs, but it touches every aspect of our lives, recently more than ever.
¿Cómo está Ernesto? Buenos días. ¿Está listo para trabajar en el campo hoy?
Sí, cómo no, voy a trabajar ahora. Hay personas que me conocen de 25 años y no saben que me faltan las piernas.
¿Me puede mostrar sus prótesis?
Sí, cómo no. Estas son de aluminio y fibra de plástico. No tienen ni articulación, son rígidas. Y se puede partir por aquí. Y entonces la parte del pie se puede partir también. Una vez por aquí cargando un saco de yuca, se me partió por aquí. Porque mi hija, ya te digo que cuando esto se rompe es un problema.
This is where Ernesto goes to get his prosthetics, free of charge. But Ernesto can't get the specialized prosthetics he needs, because it's illegal for Cuba to buy them.
¿Y existen unas prótesis un poco más resistentes que usted le pudieran servir más?
Existen unas prótesis más resistentes, con más calidad. Caminaría mejor, incluso podía trabajar mucho más, pero no tenemos acceso a ella por el bloqueo.
Ernesto doesn't complain. In Cuba, we've lived with scarcity for so many years, we take it for granted. The blockade is the longest trade embargo in modern history. It isn't motivated by concerns about human rights. It's about money and power. Until 1959, Cuba was like a US colony. Our economy was controlled by US companies, corrupt politicians, and the mafia. After the revolution, Cuba nationalized the US companies. We claimed our sovereignty, our right to govern ourselves. The government gave basic rights to the majority: women, black people, campesinos, the working class. The blockade was retaliation. It's basically a form of economic warfare. The blockade stops Cuba from doing business with the United States. They can't buy our stuff and we can't buy theirs. And we can pay for things because banks won't lend us money or even let us open accounts. The blockade also stops Cuba from doing business with other countries. That's not all. The blockade also locks us out of a big part of the internet. We're used to getting bad news from the United States.
But 5 years ago, nos llegaron por primera vez buenas noticias de la Casa Blanca.
Does not serve America's interests or the Cuban people to try to push Cuba towards collapse.
Obama announced new relations with Cuba. He began by loosening the blockade. US airlines and cruise ships started taking tourists to Havana. Business was booming. Clandestina became Cuba's first independent design store in 2015. Idania is Clandestina's co-founder. She started the store after Cuba opened its economy to private business.
Clandestina pretende establecer el trabajo de los jóvenes diseñadores cubanos.
After Idania met Obama, Clandestina became a symbol of Cuba's new private sector.
Havana was like overcrowded, celebrities, musicians, politicians, everybody. It was insane. Chanel runway, Fast and the Furious shooting, Rolling Stone concert. The mood was anything is possible, all this sense of change, and finally to be aware of I have a future here. I can stay here, I don't have to leave my country. But then Trump won the election, so.
But all of the concessions that Barack Obama has granted the Castro regime were done through executive order, which means the next president can reverse them, and that I will do.
The Trump administration is imposing new restrictions on U.S. travel to Cuba.
John Bolton making a South Florida stop today to talk to the Cuban American community.
Unveiling sweeping changes to Cuba policy.
A major blow to the new U.S.-Cuba relationship.
The U.S. has banned flights.
All families to leave Cuba.
The U.S. government will also ban trips by cruise ships.
We'll have to go after their finances.
Limiting the amount of money.
Fresh U.S. sanctions.
It's part of a trend.
U.S. tourism stopped. And if you don't have tourism, you don't have business. No tourism, zero remittances, no trade at all. You are suffocating the private sector. You are suffocating the Cuban people.
Since COVID, things have gone from bad to worse.
¿Tiene ibuprofeno por casualidad?
No, mamita, eso está en baja.
¿Y warfarina?
Tampoco.
¿Y metformina?
Tampoco.
¿Y enalapril?
Eso está en baja.
You'd think the US might loosen the embargo during a pandemic. Nope. Recently, 2 Swiss companies refused to sell Cuba ventilators because they were owned by a larger US company. And a US-owned airline wouldn't take a donation of masks and ventilators to Cuba. On top of all that, the Trump administration made it even harder for our family members in the U.S. to send us money.
The Trump administration has killed a deal that would allow Cuban baseball players to play for Major League Baseball.
El bloqueo afecta hasta nuestro deporte nacional.
Cian Vega is one of Cuba's top young baseball prospects.
Desde chiquito siempre mi papá me inculcó entrenar, me llevaba todos los días a la pelota. Empecé a ver mi talento a partir de los 13, 14 años. Hay ya bastantes peloteros cubanos en la MLB que se han formado aquí en Cuba. Representar a mi país en el más alto nivel, que es la MLB, sería mi sueño, la verdad. Trump, cuando nos cerró las puertas de firmar con la MLB, casi todos los peloteros se sintieron mal por esa noticia.
Claro, porque ahora, en caso de que tú quisieras jugar con la MLB, tendrías que renunciar.
Tendría que renunciar a mi país, no me gustaría, la verdad. Me gustaría jugar y volver a mi país, vivir con mi familia, no estar lejos de ella.
For his rivals, tonight just might be the last big chance to stop Donald Trump.
It's hard to believe now, but 5 years ago, some Cubans thought a Trump presidency wouldn't be that bad.
Si me tuviera que escoger, yo escogería a Donald Trump.
Y sabe que Cuba tiene un mercado virgen.
Y a él le interesaría mucho invertir en Cuba. Entonces no creo que todo ese proceso que ha ocurrido lo eche para atrás.
That same month, Trump's executives were visiting Cuba and playing golf here. It wasn't the first time Trump tried to do business in Cuba.
This is the website for La Oficina Cubana de Propiedad Industrial. It's where foreign companies apply to do business in Cuba.
In 2008, Trump registered his brand name for hotels, casinos, beauty contests, television programs, and golf courses.
I'm okay with the Cuba situation, but I want to tell you they should be making a good deal.
So what or who made Trump change his position on Cuba?
Guys, we have a con artist as the front runner in the Republican Party.
Thank God he has really large ears, the biggest ears I've ever seen.
And you know what they say about men with small hands?
Rubio, total lightweight.
If he hadn't inherited $200 million, you know where Donald Trump would be right now?
No.
Selling watches in Manhattan.
Trump's fight with Rubio didn't last long.
A man that's really become a friend of mine, Senator Marco Rubio. Great guy.
After Trump won, they became allies. Trump let Rubio pick his Latin American team, and Rubio wrote Trump's new Cuba policy.
I have wonderful memories from our visit during the campaign. I was right before the election. I guess it worked, right?
Trump's war in Cuba has won him the support of powerful Cuban American businessmen and politicians like Marco Rubio. They helped him win Florida, the country's biggest swing state, in 2016. And Trump believes this is the way to win again in 2020.
I'm Cuban and support Trump.
I am so thrilled to be back here with all of my friends in Little Havana.
When US presidents say they are talking to the Cuban people, they're not talking to us. Because we don't get to vote in Florida.
Pero los cubanos no cogemos lucha con la política de los Estados Unidos. El bloqueo está ahí y punto. Así que para adelante, que no hay más nada.
Okay, thank you.
You're back up.
Okay. I wanted to let you know briefly that there are a lot of activities going on, again, in the resources that I sent you, thanks to the National Network on Cuba Saving Lives campaign, the Canadian Network on Cuba, Global Health Partners, many friends of Cuba. We were able to send 6 million syringes. They will be there by the end of this month, and that's how Cuba is going to be vaccinating the rest of its population. El PAN, which you'll see in the information, is collecting donations for food. Cuba recently reached out and said what they need most is chicken cooking oil and detergent. The Saving Lives campaign has introduced a resolution campaign. Over 30 have been passed by cities, counties, unions all over the country demanding the end of the embargo. Pastors for Peace is actually taking not this caravan, another caravan to Cuba, November 13th to 26th. If you're interested in traveling to Cuba right away, the application deadline for Pastors for Peace is October 1st. And these pictures that you see in front of you are caravans, the last Sunday of every month all over the US, caravans on the 17th of the month in Canada and also around the world. These are in the United States. People are getting together to say, we want to end the embargo. And I'm hoping that you will join them. So these are some of the pictures, and we have like 5 minutes for questions, but if there are any, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, I do know we've got some in the chat already, so let's start with those. Got a few minutes left for Q&A. And the first one was from Matthew, scrolling up. Why did the U.S. turn down an association with Fidel Castro? Do you have an answer to that? Do you know?
Well, even before Fidel was, even before the revolution, and when he was in the mountains, the U.S. was like, this isn't somebody we can control and somebody we want to associate with. So I have a feeling they knew from the beginning that they were not going to be able to have the kinds of overseer of Cuba. That's just my impression.
I think that answers. I think that answers Matthew's second question in the chat first. So again, folks, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can use the hand raise function or put an asterisk in the chat, and we'll recognize you so you can ask them yourself. Matthew, did that cover your question? Both of your two questions there?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. If there aren't any other questions, I just want to mention, especially in New Hampshire, we have very powerful senators. One is on the Foreign Relations Committee, Jean Shaheen. The other, Maggie Hassan, is on the Finance Committee. Both of these committees have a lot of power when it comes to Cuba. So I don't want to be the only one. I hope I'm not the only one who ever contacts them to say, please sign on. Here's a legislation, the Cuba Trade Act of 2021 to lift the embargo, removal of provisions restricting trade and other retributions introduced by the chair of Senate Finance, Ron Wyden, co-sponsored by Leahy, Dunbar, Durbin, and Markley. So it's Senate Bill 249. Please ask the senators to, if you're in New Hampshire, to sign on to that. If you're in another state, ask your senators to sign on to it. It's a very important bill, and we're hoping that we can convince the powers that be to.
So I actually have a question. If nobody else is going to jump in, you said that travel restrictions were snapped back into place under Trump. If we wanted to go to Cuba now, what kind of process would that take, and how could we do that? How could we visit Cuba?
Get in touch with me. I'm going to take a group as soon as I feel it's possible to do that. I have, as I said, taken 4 delegations down. I can't wait to go back again. I strongly advise people to go, especially if it's your first trip, to go with an organization. You will get into places that you cannot possibly get into on your own, to visit schools, to visit hospitals, doctors' offices, the Latin American Medical School. You can't get to the kinds of places that you want to on your own. It is possible to go to Cuba. A lot of flights. The time that made life so pleasant was when JetBlue started flights from Boston directly to Havana. They were flying. It was wonderful. Get on a plane and end up in Havana rather than going through wherever. When we first started, we had to go through other countries. I have a lot of stories I can tell you about what that was like. But it is possible to go to Cuba. It absolutely is. Personally, I'm going to wait a little bit longer, make sure that things with COVID settle down a little bit more, and that But I'm planning, hopefully in the spring, to go again. So get in touch with me, Diane Stradling at gmail.com. If you are interested in anything I talked about, I'm very anxious to dialogue with other people about Cuba. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
We've got a question from Chris Hansen. Let me just pull that up. So what entity in the US enables the similar ousters against Venezuela, Nicaragua, et cetera? So Chris, do you want to expand on that question a little bit? I'm not sure I did it justice. Are you simply looking for the letters CIA?
I'm looking for anything that might be identifiable. That sounds like a real likely and quick code, but is there a particular historical reflex built into the US policies that accounts for it? Because it's so similar to how we relate to Venezuela, how we relate to Nicaragua, and probably other countries that could be identified as socialist or leaning socialist, or perhaps having a history of relations with the Soviet Union. So is there any particular, I mean, if I write to Jean Shaheen and say, you got to stop listening to so-and-so, who am I going to identify as the person that she should be wary of?
Oh. Well, of course, Marco Rubio. His name comes up all the time. He's in the Senate. I'm trying to think of who else is on Senate, the Foreign Relations Committee, who is problematic, but I can't think of it right at the moment.
It's a problematic committee in general. So we are about out of time. There was one more question from Matthew, and that is, after that, Sarah and Jennifer, if you're willing to share the information about the Quaker organization that is sending aid to Cuba, you can jump right in and do that. Let me ask Matthew's question. I don't know if you'll have an answer to it. I know I don't have an answer to it. Matthew wants to know, are there any islands nearby that the U.S. could relocate Guantanamo, and are there plans for that? I don't think so, but I haven't heard of any. I mean, there are other islands, but I haven't heard of plans to relocate, or Obama promised to get rid of it, but then didn't.
If you take a look at the map of Cuba, that bay is in a very, very strategic, it's a huge bay, and the whole bottom part of it is the base. And there are people who live on the bay above it. And there's something in the information that I sent out, there's a film about that. The US has as far as I could see, no intention of budging as far as Guantanamo is concerned. I don't know where else they would put it or why they would put it anywhere else, because Cuba is so strategically located. It's this big island with these large, deep water ports in very strategic locations. So there would be no motivation for them to move it. And who else wants it? Who else would be inviting us to come and invade their country and set up a base?
All right, so we are out of time. Sarah and Jennifer, did you want to mention the Quaker organization doing work in Cuba?
Sorry.
You're gonna have to unmute.
Okay, so basically, I don't think we have enough information. And what Sarah was asking is, we know that we have had a lot of trouble that we didn't used to have getting aid to Quakers in Cuba, who are out in Oriente province and suffering quite a bit during the pandemic. And you seem to have ways of getting stuff around the embargo, and I'm just curious.
Email me, we'll talk about it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll make sure.
All
Do you
right.
have each other's contact information, or should I?
Not just now.
I'll get you in touch.
Okay.
So that is going to be it for tonight, folks. Diane, thank you so much for talking to us tonight. Really appreciate your presentation. There are a lot of comments in the chat thanking you for it. Stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action by joining our email list. We send 1, maybe 2 emails a week, and on Friday you always get updated upcoming events. The series is going to remain free and open to everyone. However, if you are feeling moved to contribute at this time, you can go to nhpeaceaction.org/donate and make a donation there. Our next few conversations, September 20th, which is next week, we'll have Sandra Yarney and Will Thomas, who are going to talk about their work with the Palestine Education Network. The week after that, September 27th, we'll have John Rainwater, the National Executive Director from National Peace Action. We've already had Kevin, the National President, but John will be on 27th. Make sure you join us on Friday, October 1st for our fall fundraiser with Phyllis Bennis. And then we will move back in on October 11th with the conversation series. We're going to be hosting Jahan El-Bisi, who's going to talk about Indigenous Peoples Day, celebrating resilience in Indian country. Diane, any final things before we shut it down for the night?
I just appreciate everyone's being here. I am always ready. If anybody needs a speaker to come talk about Cuba, invite me. I would love to come. So it's a topic that I never, ever get tired of. And I'm anxious to return, and I would love for you all to come with me. It's an amazing experience. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Doreen. And thank you all for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. Good night.
Good night.